We have two scriptures this morning. Our first is from Matthew. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are mourning. They will be consoled." And from John, Jesus spoke to his disciples. "The truth of the matter is, you'll weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You'll grieve for a time, but your grief will turn to joy. When a woman is in labor, she cries out because her time has come. When she has borne her baby, she no longer remembers her pain because her joy that a child has been born into the world." Ancient words. In sort of the same way, you are now grieving, but I will see you again, and then you'll rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. On that day, you'll no longer question me about anything. The truth of the matter is, if you ask God for anything in my name, it will be given to you. Until now, you haven't asked God for anything in my name. Ask, and you will receive, so that your joy will be complete. Ancient words for modern day consideration.
Good damage control there. Yeah. Well, the boys wrote it, so we have to do some adjusting to find balance. We're doing a series on the emotions as ways to understand ourselves and to see each emotion as a gift, as something that helps us be more alive, more loving, but how each one requires a certain skill. I've been asked to keep this. My cough comes too fast for me to catch it, so I usually miss that. But in theory, I'm doing this, and I'm going to preach without a mask. So if that makes you uncomfortable, you can move back. Although my lung power is not enough to send things out very far. So today we're looking at sadness. And sadness, we usually think of that as a problem we're trying to get rid of. Which is very sad because sadness is such a part of life. Sadness is the body processing change. And when we try to fight that, it's very painful. I mean, it's usually painful anyway, but the more we fight it, the more pain there is. The more we can accept it, the sooner that becomes something at least more pleasant. When we have a loss that's profound, that never goes away. When we understand that, there's always a kind of a sadness when certain memories come up. But I also think, after a lifetime of doing this job, that grief is probably the most creative thing we do as human beings. It's probably the most profoundly creative thing that we do, because what grief is how the body feels as it adjusts to a new reality. Life is changed. The body has to redistribute. It's like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. I'm sure that's not a very pleasant experience at the time. But what Jesus and Buddha and so many of the teachers of humankind have said is if we can honor all the different emotions that we have, all the different feelings, they each have a kind of gift to give us. Which doesn't mean that our troubles are sent to us to teach us something. It just means that there's something that we can usually get from life. Not always, but usually or often anyway. So today we're asking the question, how can we make sadness an art in our lives? To not dishonor and disown the memories and the griefs that we have, but also not to give up on life and on the future. Not to have the best part of our lives behind us. That's a very sad situation. And it's just kind of natural and normal for that to happen as we get older. So this is a kind of gift that I think Jesus is trying to give us on how to turn grief into something that's more meaningful and more beautiful. One of the things I say a lot, and I say it because everybody here knows it, but it doesn't sink in, and that is that life is change. We know that intellectually, but we still treat relationships as though they were permanent. We treat situations when things happen that are painful like that, we see them as somehow unnatural. And yet life is change. We have a tendency to try to see life as this kind of tender thing we're keeping in a crystal jar. And we're just so afraid of that jar breaking, it's spilling and dissipating away. But actually life is very powerful. Life is like a river. And it flows through us. And our life is change. That's very painful when it's really happening. If you're young, then put this in the freezer for 20 years. But you reach a point where every time you look in the mirror, there's a little less there to see. Right? When you play tennis, you jump a little lower each time. And part of what religion has to be is coming to terms with that, coming to peace with that. And to realize that grief is the price we pay for loving. To realize that the grief that we feel is the price that we pay for having cared. And it may not feel like it all the time. Sometimes we think it'd be great just to be apathetic and not feel anything. But deeper in our hearts, we know that's not what we want. And if we go back and do it again, usually we would give the same love, knowing the same results would happen. Because that memory is such a treasure. That love was such a treasure. Jesus represents a person and a teacher, but he also speaks sometimes as life itself, the life process. When Jesus talks personally as a teacher, that's Jesus. When Jesus speaks as life itself or as universal love, that's the Christ. And part of what the stories are trying to tell us is to get to Christ, you have to lose Jesus. Right? Jesus has to die for Christ to be born. So in the resurrection stories, if you look at them carefully, they're stories of mistaken identity. And the reason they're stories of mistaken identity, I believe, is the point is not that Jesus' body got up again, but the disciples all of a sudden could see Christ in each other, in strangers and people that they were going along the side. That in traditional Christianity, you are permanently a child and Jesus and God get to be the adults. In mystical Christianity, there's a transmission that takes place where Jesus says, I no longer call you students, I call you friends. Listen to this story from Luke. We'll do communion in a bit. This is Luke's version of communion. Two disciples are going on the way to Emmaus. They don't recognize Jesus. He's going to go on, so they ask him to stay with them. As they sat down to eat, Jesus took the bread and blessed it. Then he broke it and gave it to them. Suddenly their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And at that moment, Jesus disappeared. Can you see the transmission there? that until they did a communal ritual, a communal art piece, where they recreated the death of Jesus by taking the bread and breaking it, and then sharing it, and then seeing each other as sacred expressions of this source, this ground of being. Then they knew what Jesus had been saying all along. Right? Until then, they didn't really understand what was being taught. I don't believe in any of Scripture literally. That may be the thing to love. I believe that hell is when we get stuck in an earlier happiness. If you look at the misery that's there when grief won't go away, it's usually the memory of an earlier happiness, which is very important to remember. You don't want to lose it, you don't want to dishonor it, but at some point you want to see that sacred something here and now. And we honor the people we've lost and the things we've lost, not by putting it behind us and forgetting that it happened, but by going more deeply in the love that's there. And then we begin to see it everywhere. I don't think Jesus came to tell us about himself. I don't believe he was that arrogant. I don't believe he came here to say he was the child of God. He came to teach us that we are the children of God, and that each one of us is a sacred gift. So life changes. It hurts like hell. It feels like hell. But what he's going to try to say is that's not the end of the story. The next thing he says to the disciples is the world will rejoice and you will grieve. Or you will grieve and the world will rejoice. When you look at what is happening to our nation, if you care, you're going to grieve. When you look at what is happening to the planet, if you care, you're going to grieve. But people are in denial. It's so much easier to feel anger than it is grief. And you have a lot of people who realize patriarchy is over. Right? It's something that's dead but it's walking still. It still has the power now, but it's dying. And that makes them really sad, but they're not willing to grieve it. Instead, they're going to fight. There are people who can't give up on the American empire. They don't want to know any of the history, the real history of our nation. They don't want to face the white supremacy that has stained this nation since the founding. That would require grief. What Jesus was teaching people to do was to feel the grief without losing the peace. Sometimes we lose it just because we're human. But he teaches us how to find home again when we do get lost by going more deeply into that love. Grieving is the healing. Grieving is the medicine. Grieving is the path to future happiness. Denying that we're in grief only makes it last. This is a quote I ran across that I really liked this week. Grieving is a journey that teaches us how to love in a new way, now that our loved one is no longer with us. Let me read that again because I broke that up. Grieving is a journey that teaches us how to love in a new way, now that our loved one is no longer with us. Consciously remembering those who have died is the key that opens the hearts, that allows us to love them in a new way. So it's not, when people say just forget it, move on, let it go. It's realizing that the person we've loved and lost is an expression of the river of life. And that life was what we loved in them. Whatever eternity means, it's happening right now. So when people say you have to wait, you have to die and go to heaven and then you get to see everybody again, Whatever that is here and now. The disciples felt Jesus with them. When you love and lose somebody, have you ever been doing something else and all of a sudden you just kind of felt the presence there by doing something that y'all loved together? If you were dead and looking down at somebody who is mourning you, would you want them to spend the whole time crying? Or would you want them to come back to the joy that you had shared? I think you would be wanting that more than anything. We can't just let go. It would dishonor the memory. There's a wound there that has to heal. At the same time, sometimes we get addicted to that pain. And we think that's honoring what we've lost. What I think Jesus is saying is, if you remember how much the other person loved you too, at some point they would want you to see that joy and beauty all around you. Grief hurts, and we can forget the process of living. Taoism is a nature religion in China, and they sometimes call grief the winter of the soul. In winter, the life leaves the branches and goes into the roots. You can't see it. Everything looks dead. But there's something deeply creative happening, which is why in Christianity, they put the birth of Jesus in the dead of winter and the death of Jesus at spring. That seems backwards. But it's saying, remember the circle of life wherever you are on it. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes it hurts too much. And that's okay. We're only human. But Jesus is reminding us when we come back to ourselves that circle goes on. And that's what communion meant. Communion is reframing the funeral of a man who had been executed by the state and turning it into art. To demonstrate to our bodies, symbols are for the brain, rituals are for the heart. When we come together and take that bread and break it up and say, that's what Jesus used to be, and we each take a piece, we're realizing it's not just about Jesus' pain. We suffer too. And just as the suffering of Jesus was redemptive, so can ours be. The final thing that I hear this passage saying is that grief turns into joy. At least it can. If you want to learn courage, there's no other path than fear. Right? If you want courage to be real in your life, facing our fears is the only way to do that. If we want wisdom, the only way to get there is through confusion, coming to know our confusion better. If you want to have empathy with others, your grief is the only teacher there is to learn it from the inside out. What these stories are telling us is not that our pain doesn't matter. It does. They're not saying that sometimes that pain will not be overwhelming and we'll forget there is a future. I often think of grief as like being a roller coaster, and half the time you're underwater. And when you're underwater, you feel like that's what the future's going to be like this from now on. But life is a circle, and it goes round. And sometimes our hearts break open to a larger life, to a larger love. Another quote that I ran across this week that I really liked was Kahlil Gibran. He said, the deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. And Jesus uses the image of giving birth, and granted, he was a guy, so it's a lot less clear in that situation. The point, I think, is that if you could look back at the loves that you've lost, that have torn your heart out. And somebody said, you cannot have that pain, but you won't ever have that relationship. You won't have those memories. I would guess most all of us would rather face the pain than lose the experience of that love. That's my guess. So Jesus uses the image of giving birth, not to minimize the pain, but to say, when we look at our wounds in the larger circle of life, there's almost always something that we can give as a gift and receive as a gift. Not all the time, sometimes the pain's too great. But sometimes we can have those glimmers, and that's all we really need, just sometimes. If you don't believe this about yourself, think about the people you admire most in life. And think about the sorrow that they had to face to get to the wisdom and love that became recognized. This is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who dealt with death and dying. She said, the most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and a deep, loving concern. Beautiful people do not just happen. That strikes me as a truth being there. So I believe that grief, even though none of us would choose it, is the most profoundly creative thing we do in life. Where, because life is change, that's what it is. Our body processes that, and it hurts like hell. But as long as we know that's not the last word, and as long as we remember we're not alone, and there are other people who will share that pain with us, it transforms. As hard as it is to believe, our courage really comes from our fears. Our confusion, our wisdom really comes from our confusion. And our empathy, that empathy that the world needs so desperately in our time, that empathy comes from our grief. Well, these are my understandings of these words. That's the best I can do. We'll take a moment now for you to think how you would have preached it.
So it's time for our call to service and offering. We present these gifts as our act of commitment to the values to which we ascribe. May they be used to bring justice where justice reigns, to pour out mercy to those who need it most, and be a tangible sign of love for our world. May our offerings bring help and hope to people who are suffering. Will the ushers please come forward?